This lesson for Honors Geometry is on congruent figures in Chapter 3, Section 1. Our objectives for today are to identify the corresponding parts of congruent figures. Whenever two figures have the same size and shape, they are called congruent. You are already familiar with congruent segments, segments that have equal lengths, and congruent angles, angles that have equal measures. In this chapter, you will learn about congruent triangles. Here we are given that triangle ABC and triangle DEF are congruent. If you were to mentally slide triangle ABC to the right, you can see that it fits exactly over triangle DEF by matching up the vertices like this. We can now see that vertex A lines up with vertex D, vertex B lines up with vertex E, and vertex C lines up with vertex F. The sides and angles will then match up like this. Our corresponding angles will be angle A corresponds to angle D, angle B corresponds to angle E, and angle C corresponds to angle F. Our corresponding sides will say that side AB corresponds to side DE, side BC corresponds to side EF, and side AC corresponds to side DF. Do you see that since congruent triangles have the same shape, their corresponding angles are congruent, and since congruent triangles have the same size, their corresponding sides are congruent? Based on this, we have the following definition. Two triangles are congruent if and only if their vertices can be matched up so that corresponding parts, which are the angles and sides, of the triangles are congruent. So let's take a look at example 1. We are given that polygon ABCDE is congruent to polygon LMNPQ. This means, for example, that angle A corresponds to angle L, angle B corresponds to angle M, that segment AB corresponds to LM, and that the length of DE corresponds to the length of PQ. So this means that angle A is congruent to angle L, angle B is congruent to angle M, segment AB is congruent to segment LM, and that the length of DE is congruent to the length of PQ. So we are going to fill in the missing sides or angles to complete the following statements. So what you're going to want to look at is you're going to want to look at your congruency statements. So we know the fact that ABCDE is congruent to LMNPQ means that angle D, which is right here, should be congruent to angle P. We now know that angle Q, which is here, should also be congruent to angle E. We now know that DC, so DC is right here, must be congruent to PN. So we want to make sure we're going in the correct order. So that was a good error for me so that I can show you what we need to make sure we do. So if we go in the order of D to C, I need to make sure that I go in the order from P to N. And then lastly, segment AE is going to be equal to segment LQ. So for example 2, the two pentagons shown are congruent. So we're going to complete our congruency statement, and then we're going to verify what angles and segments are congruent. And then lastly, we're going to see if E is a midpoint of any segment. If that's yes, which ones they are and why. So what we have is that EDCBA, so EDCBA, which is right here. So we know that ED is going to be congruent to EI. We know that DC is going to be congruent to HI. We know that CB is going to be congruent to HG, and that BA is going to be congruent to GF. And lastly, that AE, I'm going to give that 5 tick marks, is going to be congruent to FE. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We also know that the angles are going to be in correspondence too. So we know that this angle is going to be congruent to this angle, and I can continue on. This angle is going to be congruent to this angle, and so on and so forth. So if we want to continue, we can go ahead and mark our diagram. 1, 2, 3, 4. So you're noticing that I'm putting the same number of tick marks so that it's very easy for us to determine what angles and what sides are going to be in correspondence. So we're going to go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So it's getting a little cramped, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. But this is going to help us in determining what our congruency statement is going to be. So if we follow our tick marks, we now know that E, D, C, B, A is going to be congruent to E, I, H, G, F. So E, I, H, G, F. So also based on this congruency statement, I can now see that angle C is going to be congruent to angle H. That segment BC is going to be congruent to segment GH. And that segment GF is going to be congruent to segment BA. So based on what we know about congruent figures and corresponding sides and angles, is E the midpoint of any segment? And the answer to that is yes. So we know the midpoint is the point that cuts a segment into two congruent segments. So based on this, we can see that AE, so segment AE, is congruent to FE. And also we can see that DE, so segment DE, is congruent to segment IE. So for both of these cases, we can see that E is the midpoint of these two segments. This is the end of section 3.1. If you have any questions, feel free to watch the lesson again and take down any notes that you need. Also, if you watch the video and you still have questions after reviewing it for the second time, be sure to write down your questions and see me in class the next time we meet.